So welcome, Ollie, to the podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for agreeing to come on. Now, for those of you who don't know, I work with Oliver here at D5, and I've known Oliver for about 18 months, I believe now.
Yeah, almost 2 years now.
Yeah. And it's been good to get to know Oliver. He's a strength coach who specializes in the neuro performance and brain function in particular. And it's a bit of a hard one actually for me to describe. I see you do the drills and the eye drills and all that sort of stuff. Just for people that might not be aware of what that neuro performance and that style of brain training is, could you just explain to people in simple terms in the beginning?
Yeah, wow, it's a tough one. So I think the brain really is the center of my model. So when I look at an athlete or a client, it's their brain I'm most interested in impacting on. So the reason for that, I think, is manyfold, but virtually everything they do, from how tight their muscles are to how much strength they develop, how coordinated they are, and even their endocrine function, is all a product of their nervous system. So if I can learn how to interact with that successfully and create changes in the nervous system, you see very quick change and very lasting change if you go about it the right way. So I think it excites clients. I mean, in this day and age, we're all after things that work very quickly, that we see instant change from. It's very gratifying to see something change immediately. So if I can make an athlete stronger, faster, more coordinated, any one of those things within a session, and show them some real value, then it's really cool. Yeah.
And so how did you get that initial start? And obviously you started as a trainer.
Yeah.
But I guess piecing it together, looking backwards, it's fairly unusual. Like you not many PTs that I know, and I've worked as a strength coach and a PT for 15, 16 odd years, and you are the sort of the first guy that I'd come across. And I mean, I've heard of stuff before with the proprietary stuff that posturology, that sort of stuff. So obviously that's linked, but how did you initially get into that?
Well, I'm a bit of a geek with the science anyway, and I think for me, I was always a little bit frustrated with the results I was getting with conventional models. I did the sort of NASM stuff, the corrective stuff, your calves are tight and your hip flexors are tight and you've got this upper cross syndrome and stuff. And I kind of diligently went around trying to correct everyone's posture and trying to improve their performance, and particularly with injuries, I would stretch stuff, I'd massage stuff, I'd release tissue. And sometimes it worked because obviously there are people making a good living out of those approaches still now. But without a healthy dose of confirmation bias myself, there were, 75% of people walking away without much return on their time with me. Aside from being a little fitter, a little healthier, maybe dropping body fat, that sort of thing. But certainly the injuries and the posture stuff just wasn't changing. So I thought, okay, what controls the muscles? What controls the the endocrine response to food? And I think one of the earliest influences actually was Charles Poliquin. He recommended a course, Trigenics, actually. I think a few of his guys went on, and that was the first time I'd been exposed to this idea that stretching muscles, releasing them was really a little bit frustrating and probably not the right way to do it. So the guy introduced me to this idea of sort of correcting the nervous system. It worked really well. I was really surprised by how strong people got and how quickly they got strong, like within the session. I was like, wow, okay, this stuff is really cool. So where do I go to find more of it? And actually, all of the companies teaching neuro, including posturology, I think in the past have been, just not very well, perhaps marketed, not very well known. So I really had to dig into the sort of textbooks and network to find out where these people were, that were teaching it. So.
Yeah. And who were the sort of early guys? Obviously, you wet your beak. You spoke with Charles Poliquin, but was there someone you delved in? You started reading, and then you started seeing their name come up a bit more.
There were a few people. I mean, most of my early reading that was sort of stimulated from the sort of Trigenics discussion were neuro textbooks, I guess, neuroanatomy textbooks, looking at tracks and regions of the brain that control different things, so movement, sensation, that sort of thing. But I was aware of MAT, so muscle activation techniques, I was aware of some guys like Dougie Heel doing some interesting things.
Yeah.
I think the DNS guys were brought to my attention. I think I did a workshop of Trigenics actually, and I met some guys that had done some DNS stuff, and actually it just kind of kept spiraling really from there. I just met more and more people on courses and on kind of seminars that kept recommending other things for me to look into. And unfortunately, neuro is a sexy term, and it's a cool phrase now. Put a brain on anything, certainly supplements, and people buy it really quickly. And there's lots of stuff masquerading as neuro out there that's, I don't know, applied kinesiology, crystal healing, whatever. You know, some junk out there for sure. Some stuff that doesn't work but is being marketed as neuro. So you have to be quite careful and selective about what avenue you pursue.
And so if a trainer was listening to this, what would the certifications and the sort of areas you'd point them in initially? Who would you go to? Is there like certifications that you've done and you've said, okay, yep, these guys are good?
Yeah, there's a ton of them. I think it really depends on what direction you want to take your career. I mean, if you're into your nutrition, then there's, I think, guys now starting to focus more on the sort of brain and the gut and other areas other than just what's going in. But I think, truthfully, if you're going down the neuro sort of rehabilitative route and performance route, there's a few companies that stand out. I mean, Posturology is one of them. There's a company, Z Health, in the US that do a lot of like neuro, NKT, neurokinetic therapy. So David Weinstock, he does a lot of sort of motor control stuff. So, why is it my calf that's always tight, and why do I get pain there? And okay, well, maybe it's doing some of the job of your hamstrings because they're underactive. So some of these ideas that I got very early on, about motor control and perhaps the problem, the pain, if it's in your knee, is perhaps not a knee problem. It might be lower down or higher up. A lot of those ideas came from him initially, and from Trigenics and MAT, that sort of thing. So, and that's where I kind of started, a more mechanical and biomechanical explanation with brain kind of added, and then it kind of became more and more brain focused as I realized that was kind of still controlling everything. Yeah, cool. And so if you could sort of dumb it down and explain it to, say, if you got a new client in, and they came to you because of some sort of pain issue, whether it was lower back or shoulder pain, just explain how you'd, I guess, explain it to them, but what's the process of problem solving? I've seen you work with people before, and you've tested things on me where it becomes a bit of like a trial and error. You test, you retest, and you see what works. And I think is a powerful tool because you can see quickly if someone's getting results or if it's not working altogether. So could you just explain? So this is tricky because the neuro stuff I've studied, and the best companies out there, the best textbooks out there, we still don't know a lot of what the brain does, and stuff's changing all the time. Honestly, I think just like nutrition, just like training, it's still best guess, and it's testing it on the athlete, seeing what happens, and changing it from there. But I guess if I'm to start somewhere, I usually start with clients with good history to see what kind of happened before the injury. That often leaves a lot of clues. And then gait's a really powerful assessment for brain function. You see a lot from someone's gait, not just from a mechanical perspective, but actually what the brain's doing, because parts of the brain, for instance, are kind of more heavily involved with maintaining sort of postural muscle tone, and others are involved more with voluntary movement. So you can really see that in gait, and you can really see what's going on with someone's brain. And what would you sort of typically see from, say, we'll talk about the client type that we see here, typically sympathetic dominant, quite highly stressed, work long hours, probably don't eat the correct sort of stuff. What sort of things could you pick up from just looking at someone's walking gait? Lots of stressed out brains, so you hit the nail on the head. People with very poor cerebellar function. Cerebellum is part of the brain that helps to coordinate complex, non-linear movement. It helps us with balance, with accuracy. It helps us coordinate thought as well, actually. It's always been typically thought about as a movement part of the brain. So people with very poor brain function in their cerebellum then come into gyms, and often, if they're not seeing someone like us that's been around and we've done lots of training, they sit on machines that are very linear, don't require any accuracy, and they exercise and they get somewhat fitter and they see some benefits, but they're not really doing their biggest bang for the buck stuff, which is free weight, compound exercises, lots of variety in angle, and stuff that challenges their accuracy, their balance. We're not talking about the functional training on Bosu balls and balancing on stuff,
Yeah.
but definitely stuff that requires them to use their whole body and to perform stuff with some accuracy and some technique. Because these guys are sitting down, they're doing nothing, and what we do know about the brain is that probably the most powerful stimulator of cognitive function is movement, and not the aerobic exercise like we used to think, because that was largely based around blood flow and improvements in aerobic function, but actually stuff that challenges your coordination, puts you under load, that seems to really enhance cognitive function. So
okay, cool. And then so just touching on so we spoke about gait analysis. What would something else that you'd sort of look at initially? I see you do a lot of forward bend tests.
So the other measurements are not nearly as objective because there's tons of things that can affect range of movement. So it's all just data collection really. So I use some sort of biofeedback with clients that might be, if they're coming in with an injury, the best one to use with clients like that is pain, I think. So, objectively, you came in at 7 out of 10 on a pain scale, Mr. Smith, when you went into shoulder flexion. You're getting way more shoulder flexion now, and it's 2 out of 10. So fantastic. We're getting a great result with that. So that I feel is pretty objective. That's a really nice measure. Range of movement when they're healthy, they haven't got any problems. It gives me some insight into the sort of nervous system, because generally speaking, you'll see particularly certain muscle groups when they're more parasympathetic, when their brain's more relaxed, under less threat. You'll generally see things start to increase in their range of movement, but we'll use peripheral vision, perfusion index, blood pressure, gait itself as a reassessment. So I'll try and collect as many data points as possible, because no one neuro test really gives me 100% clear vision on what's going on. Yeah,
and I find it quite interesting, and I really admire the way you also program with clients that come in. You don't necessarily have each time a periodized program or something. You use a lot of biofeedback, and you watch how that person might present in that session, which I think is a powerful tool, and I don't think enough trainers do that. As a client might have come in after 4 hours sleep the night before, their partner might have cheated on them or something like that, and you use a little bit of biofeedback. Can you just explain how you use that, and sort of what I guess results would you get from doing that, as opposed to just coming in and bashing someone over the head with the program?
Which is what normally happens, right? I mean, I think some of these ideas are coming at professional sports. It's not as weird as it sounds. There are physios that I've met and worked with that have implemented sort of similar techniques with professional football teams, and achieved like 70% reduction in injury rate purely from assessing how fatigued their athletes are, what their nervous system is, sort of in what state it's in. So simple tests, like there's a simple app on the App Store actually, a CNS test. It's like a finger tapping test, and you'd establish some sort of baseline for the client. How quickly can they tap? And it's about a minute, I think, or you can alter the time frame. But if you keep it consistent, and they're at 63 normally, and they come in and they're down at 50. You'd think, right, okay, this client of mine's fatigued. They're not in a good state to start lifting, maximum load, and perhaps even some of the coordination work won't be as good today. So it's just kind of, without sounding too holistic and wishy-washy, it's listening to the body, getting some feedback, whether it be range of movement, strength, perfusion index, gait, any one of these assessments. This CNS app that I just mentioned, heart rate variability is very popular at the moment, but actually very poorly understood. It's another measure that you can use for sure. But all of these measurements give me some insight into whether I'm going to be able to push them a little bit harder than I did last time, or whether I need to back off a little bit, get them feeling good, get them recovering so that some of their biofeedback improves within the session. Maybe work on something that doesn't require as much skill. Maybe it's some aerobic work, I don't know, but I'll pull them out of whatever they were going to do if they're not going to do that well.
Yeah, and how do you find with when you have type A personalities, they come in and they're redlining and they want sort of want. How do you sort of deal with the personalities and sort of package it so that they?
This bit is the toughest bit, because we obviously deal here at D5 with a lot of successful professionals, and they tend to be of a sort of similar personality type, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
So sometimes I think it's just building some trust and some rapport with them. I think my clients trust me, and they've seen the process now through far enough that they can really see a change when we do work to this model. So they've seen some very gratifying, very quick results. But if it's someone I've just met, I guess sometimes it's just highlighting how their performance isn't quite the same as it was last time.
Yeah.
So if it's someone that wants to bench press, it's like, okay, well, you managed 10 reps last time, you're only managing 6 today. Do you think we should change the program? Because, we're not going to set any records today. And whilst you don't have to do that every session, you want to see some progressive overload and some progress on movement. So, sometimes we'll just pull back from something we're not doing well in and go into something else. And actually, even the Type A's appreciate that because they want to be successful.
Yeah.
They don't want to fail.
Yeah. Well,
and if they're failing,
comes down to results. And I think if you can see numbers going ahead in the right directions, but I know personally when working with some people, you can see them come in and it's just... They're
one thing on the mind.
They're in bits, but
sure.
they're not doing it. And I just wondered from your approach, because I guess you've got those tests, the biofeedback. They're saying, okay, well, I can't even get my hands past my knees. 2 days ago I was touching the floor. And so that's obviously a powerful tool. Now on the D5 website, your bio has you're a self-confessed geek.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, to go down this side of neuroscience and to dig deep, I guess, into all the studies that you've gone through, and I think you're sort of someone who's not led by science, but you're very interested in science, and you read a lot of studies and books. How did you sort of develop that initially, and where did you get it? Because you started as a PT. And now you're, heavily...
Yeah. I think I've always enjoyed learning. I've not been very good at following direction. So I think if I'm told to go and study something, or when I was at school, I was kind of directed to study stuff I didn't enjoy. But I think I've always been a bit of a science geek. So I used to really enjoy science and history at school. So I think for me it was quite natural. I'd pick up books, I'd find something interesting. And with PT, it's very practical. So I'm, into my sports, into training. So I could practically go away and just try stuff, stuff I hadn't really been taught, but I'd read in a textbook and gone, okay, cool, this does this. So I wonder if I can change it or impact on it. So I think... a lot of the textbooks are pretty dry, so there's a few guys and girls doing a good job of making it more interesting out there. And again, we come back to the NKTs, the Z Health, the MAT guys, a bunch of them making the subject matter more interesting and practical. And then from there, you want to dig a little deeper and understand it a little bit better and at a deeper level for when it doesn't work or when you need something slightly different. That then stimulates the other reading. So.
Yeah. And is there any tricks or wizardry you could impart on us with in terms of retention? You strike me as someone who reads a book and then is able to then talk about it. And obviously you've got high comprehension, but is there something that anyone could do that would increase retention? Is there tricks that you do yourself that give you that edge or not? Not really.
I think you've got to be interested in it. I think if you're trying to sort of shoehorn yourself into a niche, whether it be nutrition or rehab, if you're not really passionate about it, and I know it sounds a bit corny, but if you're not really passionate about it at a deep level, I think it's going to be tough going. And sure, there's people learn different ways. So some will learn very visually. There's some great videos online. Just doing actually going through a process at the moment with medical neuroscience online with a university in the US. I think I'm picking up more from that than I have reading sort of dry neuro textbooks, because again, I like to see it visually represented. So just a mixture of media, visual, some drawing. People swear by drawing. Some of these learn anatomy by drawing it out again is really popular. So
I guess it comes down to your individual learning style, as everything is with testing and that sort of stuff. Now, when you initially came to D5, you gave a talk and you spoke about the threat bucket. Could you perhaps just explain what that is and how it works? And
sure. It's kind of a modified idea actually from a guy called Lorimer Moseley and actually his partner in crime, David Butler. They're Australian researchers and professors. One of them's Lorimer is a physiotherapist, I think originally by training, and they're deep in the sort of pain game. So they're researching how the brain sort of picks up and processes pain, what causes pain, and they work with a lot of people with chronic pain. So they formulated this model really to fit all of our current understanding into a useful model to explain how we experience pain. And previously it had been very sort of Descartesian, in the sense that it was like, something stabs your leg and a pain message goes up your nerve all the way up to the brain, and then the message comes down to your foot to kind of take your foot off the nail or whatever it is you've trodden on.
Yeah.
And yet we've got 87% of people that have had amputations that feel an unpleasant sensory experience in the arm or leg they don't have anymore. So we use this very structural model to explain pain. It's obvious there's an issue in my knee because it hurts. It doesn't work like that. And actually, you MRI 100 asymptomatic people that have never reported back or neck pain, and you'll find something like, I forget the statistics exactly, but something near 30% of people under the age of 35 will have a bulging disc that you can grade on a relatively serious level as should cause them some level of pain. And then by the time you get to 85, it's like almost 90% of us have bulging discs at multiple levels. Yeah. And yet it's still asymptomatic. So we don't have back pain. It's never affected our performance. We don't even know. Sometimes we go to the grave and don't know. Yeah. So I think it's really important that this model came about. And its sort of Reader's Digest version is basically there's lots of sensory information coming in at any one time. Visual information, vestibular information, sensory information from proprioceptors, mechanoreceptors, chemoreceptors, baroreceptors. They all sense something slightly different. They're all reporting into the brain at any given time. And our brains are really hardwired for survival. So any sort of notion of danger, any kind of threat to tissue quality, any sort of threats that feel like they may cause us to have a serious injury or to die, taken very, very seriously by our brains. They're sort of very conservatively wired, our brains. Yeah. So even the emotional stuff gets thrown in there, which is why sometimes I think when people have a bad day or they have a breakup with a partner or a really stressful day at work, they feel their back pain more. Yeah. Because all of these things cumulatively get added up to a kind of current threat level. Think about your DEFCON level. When it reaches a critical mass and suddenly brain feels a little bit overwhelmed by everything going on, and there may be no emotional stuff in there may be, I don't know, no chemoreceptive stuff, you may have no vision problems, but all of the other stuff could be enough for the brain to go, okay, crikey, there's a problem and I need you to change your behavior, because you're going to get yourself injured or killed if you continue doing whatever you're currently doing. So I think that's a grossly oversimplified explanation of it, but it's very useful in thinking outside of this biomechanical model where we've always looked at the tissue, and it's like, okay, well maybe they have a balance challenge, and that may be why their backs got pain. Okay. Because actually there's not only hardwired tracks from the vestibular system to the spinal musculature, so there's actually like a mechanical link between them. There's also this threat bucket explanation where you could go, okay, what's the biggest challenge to this person at the moment, and what's the thing that scares their brain most about their survival? Could be their breathing. And this is why you've got these empirical examples of people going to yoga or breathing classes and their back pain goes, and and so there's obviously like a hierarchical level, and I think Paul Chek touches on it in terms of his model where you're breathing, hearing, eyesight, digestion, all that stuff. There's like a hierarchy. What would you notice initially? I noticed just in myself, because I've done a lot of sort of videos and I've recorded myself, and I notice at the end of the day, if I'm fatigued, I'll have a slightly lazy eye, and we spoke about this before we hit record. And I didn't have it initially, but it became very obvious as I become fatigued. Can you sort of explain what would be going on in my small brain? Well, it's interesting because a bit like kind of biomechanical weakness as we see it in movement, you often find these weak links in the chain, fatigue first. So, if someone's got, I don't know, really weak glutes, you'll see some deviation in their knee or some collapse in their sort of lower back maybe, and if they're loading their spine. But with brain, it's very interesting to watch people, because you'll see little things, little tells like an eyelid starting to droop a little bit, or an eye not perhaps following the other one as quickly. And these are just areas that have been overtaxed during the day. So it's not necessarily a sort of a threat bucket issue, although they'll contribute to it. If you've not got both eyes focused on the same thing and providing a nice clear kind of 3D stereoscopic image of it, then brain does get a little bit freaked out by that, because it's like, oh crap, I can only really see this from the right side, not the left.
Yeah.
I don't really know how far away it is now, because I'm having to ignore this tired left eye. It's not really looking at the same thing. So it's just a weak area of the brain, and what we know from neural plasticity, the sort of thing that underpins everything that I use, the sort of science behind how the change actually takes effect, is that the brain is very malleable. It's obviously way more plastic and open to change, and way easier sort of it's more easily affected in kids, but as we age, this idea that by 21 your brain's sort of hardwired and that's it, you're done, you've got what you've got, is obviously not true. I think you look back on that retrospectively, it seems a bit silly now, because clearly you can pick up languages, you can pick up new movement skills, you can take up sports in your 40s and become very competent at them. So the brain does change plastically, and we've seen that on MRIs, we've seen it on all sorts of other brain scans. So any one of these little weaknesses people have, they can change, and with some targeted testing and some targeted drills, you can really bring, say, if it was your left eye that was a little bit weak, you can really bring that up again and get that working as well as the right one. And the benefits would be probably better hand-eye coordination, maybe less pain if it's part of your threat bucket. So it's really, really nice to be able to pick out these little weak areas and bring them up.
And if you had to generalise, I know you hate probably generalising because it's very individual what you do. But for anyone who is listening, and for people who wanted to increase the performance as a shotgun approach, say the person was going in to do a set of squats or deadlifts or whatever it is, what are some common areas that they could stimulate with the brain that would give them a bit of a response?
Bit of a lift. I think there's some really simple ways that you can quite generally across the board have some impact. I think coming back to our earlier point about sticking to sort of free weight where possible, machines, isolation does have its place, but probably less than people realise. So sticking to sort of free weight stuff that requires them to be coordinated and to have both limbs working. I think actually unilateral work is really overlooked. I think if you're way less coordinated with your left hand, and you can do sort of cerebellum tests to sort of test that, very simple ones, touching moving targets, that sort of thing. If you're much less coordinated and you're right-handed, so your left hand's a bit weak and a bit less coordinated, doing a sort of extra set or two of an exercise that requires you to be pretty accurate is important and super useful. I've seen people really increase a lot of their sort of bilateral lifts very, very quickly by just having a concerted sort of phase of unilateral work on their weak side. So being able to sort of eventually do a pistol squat on their left leg, and being able to press and pull with their left hand as competently as their right, I think makes a big difference to people.
And then if you were, like, I know we're generalizing a little bit, but in terms of if pain was a symptom, and you were treating for someone pain rather than performance, what, generally speaking, with the guys that you worked with, where have you found that the weak links usually are forming, whether it's the lower back or shoulder? Obviously different areas are going to be completely different.
This is the toughest question you've asked me so far, because it is so different for everyone. I think if I was to try and make a large population that I couldn't assess individually as robust and resilient to injury as possible, I'd get them doing, it's terribly boring, but probably some dynamic joint mobility work. As in, can you move all of your joints through every range of movement that's open in a sort of bony sense with control and precision? Because you'll see, is it Dr. Andrea Spina? He's doing his FRC now, and Kinestretch. There's lots of different companies that offer sort of joint mobility programs where you're taking all of your joints through sort of very odd ranges of movements and movements that don't happen now, unfortunately, in offices and in our sort of sedentary lifestyles. But lots of these joints we don't move are designed to move in a variety of ways, and if you can't control those at low speed, low load, then you probably shouldn't be moving into high load, high speed environments. If you've got poor control. So I think that works on the sensory and the motor components, which I think do affect people's pain and performance hugely. So yeah, and there's a couple of high win ones of those for most people that sat in offices, working on their thoracic spine, their mobility there, working on ankle mobility, working on wrist mobility, some shoulder mobility. I think would be big high payoff areas for them to work on.
Yeah. And I've heard you speak about before about spinal flexion, and we're all sort of cut from the same cloth, as in when we first came into PT school, we were taught, don't bend the spine under load.
Yeah.
And I think now we're starting to understand, obviously, the experience level of the person. You should at some point take someone through a loaded bending of the spine. Can you just sort of, what are your thoughts on that in terms of...
Yeah, I think it's a hugely useful tool with the right populations. I think, all of our joints, you ought to be able to move full range of movement relatively comfortably and competently. Otherwise, the best studies on sort of injury seem to demonstrate that where you've got these gaps between passive and active ranges of movements at joints is the area that's most vulnerable to injury, the bit you can't currently control. Your brain can't feel it, and it doesn't have the motor competency to move the joint in that range. That's where injuries happen. So, we go into spinal flexion all the time, particularly if we're playing sports. So I think not being able to go there is a real problem. So, particularly from a threat bucket perspective, the brain doesn't like stuff it can't predict. It's pretty much a sort of a Bayesian sort of machine. It's designed to predict stuff that could go wrong, and if it can't predict what's going to go wrong because it doesn't know how to move in that way, then it really freaks out about that stuff. So
I might put up on the website as well the picture that you showed us the other day, and could you just perhaps talk about how your brain predicts?
The checkerboard. Yeah, so brain predicts everything. I mean, this is one of the really interesting things to me, is that the amount of information that comes in from our environment on a daily basis, be it our internal environment, so the stuff that's going on within our own bodies, and the stuff that's coming in from the exterior, so light, sound, taste, all these things. Our body has to crunch a huge amount of data. I've heard some estimates in the region of visual information, something close to 75 gigabytes per second your brain would have to process if it processed everything from your environment. So fortunately we don't have to do that, or we'd be exhausted after a few minutes. So I think what is fairly well acknowledged now is that the brain cuts huge chunks of that information out and goes back to sort of patterns and templates that it's created over the years of what it expects to be there. And this checkerboard that I showed you guys with a shadow on it is sort of typical black, white squares, and then there's a big shadow cast over the middle, and squares A and B are actually the same colour. But even though you know that, you can't see it any differently because your brain's filling in the gaps and going, okay, well, it's got to be a white square because the next one's a black square.
I actually had to put my hand over it to get that, because my brain's going, that is definitely a grey colour.
And so I think it's wonderful, it's great, it saves us a lot of work, but our brains, this is probably the reason husbands the world over get in trouble when the wife has their hair cut and it's quite a small change to their hairstyle. We don't notice because their eyes are in the same place, their nose is about the same shape, and nothing's really massively changed. So another silly example is when you see these paragraphs on social media. If you can read this paragraph, you're part of the 1% in the world. The truth is everyone can read that paragraph pretty much, when the first and last letter are in the right place and all the other letters are jumbled up, because your brain's no longer even reading words anymore. It's just predicting them. It's like, that I recognize that word and all the letters are present, so I can see the pattern. So everything happens that way, which I think makes eyewitness testimonials for crimes and stuff really worrying, because everyone's got a slightly different report usually.
And what I heard you mention obviously the anecdote between men and women. What is there any difference neurally and in terms of what presents, and when you work with someone, is there commonalities or differences that you see between the sexes or not?
I don't know. I don't really get involved in sort of mental, emotional, sort of psychological stuff, so I couldn't comment on that. I think structurally speaking, I think they've noticed some differences. The sort of, the the funny, perhaps women are not so good with spatial awareness. The sort of parking thing comes up, and maybe catching balls and things. They don't tend to be as good. It doesn't mean they can't be as good, particularly with training. But I think certain areas of the brain are a portion higher priority for other things. So some of the emotional centers are better developed in women than they are in men. And some of that would make kind of some amount of evolutionary sense, I think.
Yeah. Very, very politically correct answer.
Yeah, man, I've got to...
Just talking about case studies, so you've told me some funny stories in the past of things that had happened with your clients, but also just touching on things that you've spoken to me before, that you spent an hour or 2 hours with a person, you haven't been able to find that sort of pinpoints that
frustrating.
That thing, the solution. Can you just talk about the people, maybe someone that you found and you pinpointed something straight away and it worked, and then also on the other scale?
Yeah. So fortunately, I feel very lucky to say that I feel like most of the time it's the latter. I've been able to jump in now with the experience and the training that I've had from various different camps and really fix stuff very quickly. So one guy recently that came in to see us here at D5, they'd been diagnosed with a frozen shoulder, been to see, I think, something like 3 or 4 physiotherapists and a chiropractor, had no change in his pain or range of movement. And within, slightly less than 40 minutes, he had full range of movement back in his shoulders, actually a video on our website, and no pain. And again, there are various things going on, some perhaps more biomechanical in their explanation, but he definitely had some sort of issues at sort of a brain level going on. So he had some sensation that he couldn't feel on that side. So some hot and cold temperature sort of issues on that side that he couldn't feel the difference between those. Some sensory loss sort of to light touch. And if you can't feel something very well, you're not going to be able to move it very well, because again, the brain won't be able to predict what's going to happen to it if you do move it. So some very simple interventions, really, stuff that looks a little bit sort of magical when you sort of, rubbing his shoulder and getting him to do some mobility drills on his opposite hip, and all of a sudden his shoulder's free. I think he was quite shocked and obviously delighted. And then other times, because I do have sort of a habit of attracting these people that have been to see everyone and have kind of lost hope about being ever fixed. I've seen one lady with quite advanced MS, and she came in a wheelchair, unable to walk, and I was the sort of last person that she sort of had any hope of helping her, and that particular situation was particularly challenging because the nervous system is deteriorating. So the stuff that I do is particularly challenging when you're trying to assess that. Because some of it you can't change much at that stage. So they've been the most galling and the most challenging.
And just touching on you had a woman, I think, who became from one of the drills, I'm not sure whether it was a drill or something, became aroused. Can you explain?
No, that's my wife's favourite story, I think. I had a particularly sort of stressed out lady coming to see me, and again, I think people may disagree with this. Trainers out there, that all the clients should be put through a sort of tough workout regardless of their sort of disposition. But this lady came in completely overwhelmed one day, sort of almost hyperventilating, sort of very, very stressed, very anxious. Pupils were massive, sort of, wound up. And so I got her to start the session. Our sort of warm-up was a bit of breathing work, some diaphragmatic breathing, get a little more parasympathetic. And then there's some stuff you can do to someone's face by pressing on sort of their trigeminal nerve and their facial nerves, the sort of sensitive spots on their face. And they all plug into an area of the brain, the brainstem, which does help to control arousal. And that's where the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system live. So you can really sort of turn someone down, like relax them very quickly, or really ramp them up very quickly, depending on where you press on their face and whether you're making it painful or quite relaxing. And this lady, I noticed, was just sort of giving one of these nerves a little bit of a manipulation, and that's her eyelids fluttering, and I thought, wow, something's happening. She said, "Oh, please don't stop." I was like, okay. She says, I think I'm going to have an orgasm. And I don't think at the time I was like, okay, I don't think I heard her correctly. So I didn't really do anything differently. And she sort of just sighed and just relaxed, and she was great after that. And at the end of the session, we didn't speak about it anymore. At the end of the session, she said, "Would you show my husband that? Because we've got kids, so, we don't have a lot of time on our hands, so we need to kind of fast-track things." And sure enough, he did come in, and I did have to demonstrate on this big guy this magic point on her face. And, that was definitely a weird experience.
Yeah. That's awesome. I heard you touch on bag breathing and diaphragmatic releasing, and we've been through some of this at D5 before. We've spoken about it. Can you talk about the reason you would give someone bag breathing and the application and then the releases if they're not using the diaphragm properly to breathe?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people, a lot of the guys listening to this, if they're trainers, will know that a lot of their clients instinctively breathing into the wrong areas. So they're doing a lot of sort of upper chest breathing. That makes the scalene, some of the muscles in the neck and the shoulders, some of these sort of accessory breathing muscles very tight and very stiff. And it's not a particularly efficient breathing pattern. It's really, I think, designed when we're in a tight spot to get us out of trouble, help us get maximum air in, and all of our sort of limb muscles get lots of extra blood. Blood gets drawn from the periphery, so in that sort of fight or flight situation is quite useful. But when you're chronically stressed out in daily modern living, it's not a particularly good pattern to get yourself into. It's definitely way more sympathetic than it is parasympathetic, and I think that's why things like yoga have such a big following, because people get not only an hour out of their day to concentrate on themselves, but they get to lay down, they get to sort of again reset this breathing pattern a little bit by breathing into their belly. And bag breathing, if you've ever seen anyone get into a bit of an anxious state on a plane or anywhere else where they've started to really get a bit freaked out and started to sort of not hyperventilate by the sort of medical definition, but started to really breathe heavily and start to take short, sharp breaths into their chest, they often get handed something like a brown paper bag to breathe into. And one of the reasons that relaxes you is that helps to bring up carbon dioxide levels in the lungs again. So there's actually an effect called the Bohr effect. And if you remember your sort of diffusion across gradients from school, where stuff goes from high concentrations to low concentrations, you actually need enough carbon dioxide in your body to maintain this gradient for oxygen to travel across membranes and into tissues properly. So if you chronically hyperventilated, you could have too little carbon dioxide, and yet your brain feels like you're not getting enough oxygen, and that's what drives that repetitive cycle of breathing faster and faster and faster. So bag breathing is hugely useful for someone very anxious, very stressed. It's a very quick way to concentrate carbon dioxide in a bag for them to rebreathe. So you'd only do it for a short period of time just to get them more relaxed, and then go back to sort of diaphragmatic breathing.
And how would you assess whether that person was in fact doing a diaphragmatic breathing? So we've spoken about it before and you've showed me, but like just to explain how you would assess that.
The best way to do most of the neuro tests, I mean, including stuff like gait, is without the person knowing. Because all of a sudden you get the sort of catwalk version, the sort of stiff, oh crap, I've got to walk really well here, because everyone wants to win at stuff, right? So, when someone's breathing, as soon as I tell them we're doing a breathing assessment, they automatically often get a little bit better just from the fact that they're focusing on it and they want to be better at it. So I try and watch them in our consultation. I look at whether the belly's moving in and out, and for most people it isn't. And then we do a simple high-low test, get one hand on their chest, one hand on their tummy, okay, which one's moving? And they can often feel that, I'm just breathing into my chest or very little into my sort of diaphragm. So that's quite a nice, simple test. And then we obviously try and flip that somewhat. And that's quite easy, and there's a bunch of ways you can make that quite an easy way to feel whether they're being successful, whether it be putting a hand on their tummy or like a little weight plate. I like the way you observe and test them without knowing, because I think everyone has that. And if I know that I'm being tested on something, I'll try my very hardest to try and break the test. Muscle tests are the worst, particularly with guys. I mean, none of us want to fail the bicep test particularly. It's like even if it is weak, we're gonna die trying.
Exactly. And so with the bag breathing, what would be like a protocol? Would it be a minute, 2 minutes, 10 breaths, or box breathing?
Not that long at all. Some people don't like being in the sort of almost feel a bit claustrophobic with it. So you've got to kind of tweak it based on the client. But, 30 seconds to sort of max a minute, I think, for most people, and maybe repetitions of that in between some diaphragmatic practice is usually enough to get them really sort of calm down. I think it's a long time to breathe into a bag otherwise. So it's a bit hot and stuffy in there. Yeah. So for me, just 30 seconds to a minute, and then come back out, do some diaphragmatic breathing, and then back in again. Yeah.
Now, we've spoken about before, or not necessarily with you, but placebo is obviously a powerful effect on the brain, brain chemistry, results, etc. So when people think something is going to work, it generally has a powerful effect. On the contra side of that, the sort of nocebo effect of, have you encountered people that come to see you, might have been referred to by someone else, and they come in and just sort of think that you're some mystic guy who's making it up? Have you encountered that? And then obviously those tests would be sort of biased one way, and does that affect outcomes for you?
It does, yeah. I mean, I benefit as much as the next guy from placebo. People hear about me doing some crazy stuff and fixing some long-standing problem. They've already got at least hope that I'm going to help them. If it's come as a strong recommendation, I'm already in a good place when it comes to my treatment process, right? So I've got to acknowledge that for sure. But I've had quite a few guys and girls, particularly if they're fitness professionals or physios. I mean, I've treated a bunch of both, and they'll come in with a very sort of biomechanical mindset. So as soon as I start to challenge that at all for their treatment process, I definitely see a bit of a withdrawal reaction from some of those guys. But again, fortunately, despite the sort of nocebo effect, if I've been able to demonstrate value and reduce pain or increase range of movement, that creates huge buy-in. Despite, I would say, probably 6 or 7 out of 10 of the fitness or health professionals that come and see me being very skeptical about what's happening, if I've been able to demonstrate clearly that their pain or range of movement has changed, there's almost a shift right away. Yeah. They're like, okay, this is cool. Yeah. And some of those guys have gone on to study with some of the organizations I recommended, because they've been kind of motivated and perhaps inspired to pursue that channel and thought process themselves off the back of it. Because they've seen how quickly it can change stuff.
Just with working with you, I see you post a lot, or you send in WhatsApp groups and Facebook groups various controversial studies, and I think sometimes you do it more to get a reaction out of course, different trainers, which
stimulate thought processes,
which I actually enjoy, because it kind of, you have to question what you're doing all the time, because I think it's a powerful teacher. You can't sort of think that you're above it all and that you know everything. And I think, but just with the coming up and finding those controversial studies, what are some popular misconceptions or ideas that people have that you would have a polar opposing view? And it could be down the nutritional realm. I've heard you speak about before sugar not necessarily being that bad. Obviously, case by case example, you're not recommending everyone goes out and buys candy bars, but just that whole notion of controversy and how you sort of use it as well.
Well, I guess what I've tried to do, and with mixed success, I don't claim to be some perfect scientist. I've certainly bought into some ideas and some philosophies that I've later either disbanded fully or decided are not the best idea, and perhaps modified. But I've always tried to put stuff, as I did enjoy science at school, through a basic filter. Does this make sense? At a kind of A-level biology sense, A-level chemistry, maybe an A-level physics sense. Does this make any sense? And I've met fitness professionals, perhaps, and medical professionals, slightly depressingly, at very high levels in their professional world, and very well respected, doing some really daft things. One example springs to mind where I worked with a physiotherapist that was at a kind of GB Commonwealth level, that was doing some exercises for external rotators of the shoulder. So it's sort of a rotator cuff rehabilitation protocol, using a free weight, a dumbbell. And I had to break it down to this particular person the gravity was acting down towards the ground, so it was challenging the bicep, not the infraspinatus, as was intended. And there was this slightly mystified look, and then one of embarrassment when they realised that they were doing and had been doing this for years with athletes. I'm like, man, people sometimes hear stuff, particularly in our industry, sort of dogmatically handed down from one generation to the other, like a sort of a tribal sort of story, you know, something that's steeped in mystery and sort of, and I think no one really questions whether it works. And then there's a bunch of, as I say, like confirmation bias and everything else that creeps in where, you know, 10% of the time it works every time.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, well, that doesn't prove it works very well at all if it's only 10% of the time. So yeah, I guess I've just over the years tried to look at every angle and every argument, which is, you know, like a full-time job, as you know.
Yeah.
And even stuff like nutrition isn't as clear as I think people would make it out. And, you know, I certainly don't advocate people eat lots of sugar, but I think, you know, there was a whole low-carb sort of movement for years in the fitness industry, and, you know, I've certainly recommended low-carbohydrate diets to a bunch of people that I think would benefit from them, and, yeah, it's worked really well. But on the flip side, I've had people on quite low-fat diets with relatively high carbohydrates, particularly if they're stressed out. Again, that have worked very well for them. So I think, like everything, then it has to be personalized, it has to be individualized, and science changes all the time. You can't be too attached to any ideas, but at the same time, you've also got to filter stuff through what I think should be a common sense science filter, like a basic rudimentary, like, does this make sense at a basic level? Because there's also fashions that sweep our industry. You know, everyone was balancing on a Bosu at one point, avoiding fat like the plague, and then all of a sudden everyone's under, you know, heavy weights, front squatting umpteen kilos, eating no carbohydrates. So I think the needle swings way too far in one direction and the other. And actually, yeah, as far as you can, have stuff assessed by someone competent. Still go away and test it with some measurement, you know, whether it's testing your blood sugars, testing body comp, you know, and try and collect as many data points as possible. If it's your nutrition you're changing, if it's your training you're changing, you need to assess what impact it's having. And that's the only way I think you can be objective about the individual's results and response.
Yeah. Is there any other controversial stances that you would have on anything?
I think, you know, I'm a fan of, I'm not a fan of functional training, but I think I'm increasingly a fan of stuff like the calisthenics, the sort of 3D approaches to movement, so taking lots of different angles and lots of different positions with clients, because I think most of our general population are not being paid as athletes. So, you know, making them ultra specialized in particular movement patterns, I don't think is in their best interests when, you know, they want to play some sport with their kids or whatever. So I think generally most people will get enough of a change in body comp, in health, in general sort of performance from an approach that gives them plenty of variety of movement in lots of different planes. And yeah, so I think that's definitely changed over the years, because I, as a younger guy, was definitely into sort of bodybuilding, powerlifting, all of these things. But I kind of still use those tools, but perhaps less with clients now on the whole.
Yeah.
But yeah, nothing too controversial. I think nutrition, as I say, just the client in front of me. Don't get it right every time, of course, with clients, nutritionally speaking. So we just test it. You know, is this working for you? You know, after the first retest, the second retest, you know, oh no, it's not changing very much. Let's change something.
Yeah. And then obviously you got to battle with the lifestyle factors. It's all very well and good that person might be suited to a low carb diet, but if you're telling them something and they're out there smashing pizzas all the time because they love them, it's you've obviously got to work with what you've got.
Exactly. And I think that was one of my, if you're going to ask me about regrets, I guess I spent a lot of time trying to learn the sort of deep science surrounding stuff like nutrition, learning all about the endocrine system, buying heaps of books on that when I was younger, and I think I was stimulated off the back of my first biosignature seminar, and learning about the fact that there was this functional nutrition world out there and functional medicine world out there. So I went to learn all about hormones and how Mrs. Smith's estrogen was being affected by her progesterone, and actually just getting Mrs. Smith to eat less rubbish, maybe eat less generally, reduce her calories, and actually getting Mrs. Smith to sort of buy into it and actually perhaps argue for her own change and actually do some of it was way more important, way more impactful. So just getting people to eat slower, stop when they're like 80% full, just eat more vegetables. These are kind of basic things that I've introduced with probably more success than complex protocols.
Well, I mean, I think we've all been guilty of that. You do a course like that and you start focusing on the 1%ers, like we're giving them calcium deglucarate, we're giving them DIM, their hamstrings coming down in terms of body fat as their estrogen a little bit different, but then you don't realize they're drinking 2 liters of soy milk and they're not moving for a week. It doesn't matter if you can take as much as you want of those sort of supplements, but it's obviously focusing on the big areas, big bang for buck, exercises, movements, and obviously nutrition as well.
Yeah, exactly.
So just recently you went away and I think you spoke at a course or spoke with some people. You came back in particular with strength conditioning at the elite level. And you spoke to us. Could you just tell us about that trip and what you learnt just recently?
Yeah, it's really interesting working with guys that are at the highest level. I mean, one of my best friends and colleagues actually, Grant Hayes from company Switch, is really working at the highest level with athletes. And I think there's this real, but there's a very poor understanding about how athletes at the elite level are trained. And they're obviously trained very differently to Mrs. Smith and Mr. Smith that want body comp change and general health improvement. I certainly fell into the trap when I was younger of thinking everyone should, be max squatting and, piling on muscle mass. But if you look at the best athletes in the world, people like Roger Federer, people that move well and have had great careers and relatively speaking have been relatively uninjured, they move exceptionally well. And these athletes are trained in a much more sports-specific way than I think a lot of the strength and conditioning guys that are selling courses out there would have you believe. So much more, they're in similar positions that their sport requires, rather than, as I say, trying to increase their deadlift. They're trying to improve their strength in a forehand, in a backhand, so they're trying to increase their strength in those positions as opposed to something that's a little abstract and removed from their sport. They're also doing a lot of vision training, a lot of vestibular training, particularly in sports that require lots of hand-eye coordination. That's high payoff, because you can make, again, to use Roger Federer as an example, him as strong as you like. You can increase his bench press by twice as much as he was able to do at the start of the program, and yet if he can't see the ball coming quickly enough and he can't react appropriately with his positioning, placing his racket head, then it doesn't matter how strong he is if he can't see the ball. That's really where the big win is. So you'll see, I think, increasingly through sports. I mean, NFL has had a lot of press recently and sort of concussion research and them trying to fix these guys after they have all of their collisions with eye work, sort of vision work generally, vestibular work and sort of concussion rehabilitation. But actually, in a sort of performance sense now, it's really growing in the sports world at an elite level. It's really stuff they're focusing on.
And then just speaking about, we had a discussion the other day about fatigue and not necessarily putting them in that fatigue state, and how it's, everyone sort of thinks, and it gets glamorized that, these elite athletes are training to, extreme fatigue, when actual fact they're not.
I think, it's again, it's when you're working at the highest level with elite athletes, and I've not had as much exposure as some of my colleagues like Grant to working with very, very high level athletes. But the one thing that seems to come through time and time again is that, they can't afford to be injured. And so when you're, getting them under maximum weights and taking them to full sort of fatigue, the risk of injury escalates hugely at that stage. And I think, from various different schools of thought, we've learned over the years that you don't necessarily need to take the nervous system to full fatigue, certainly not every workout, to see some appreciable change in strength, in reaction time, in range of movement, in all sorts of different things. So, there needs to be some progressive overload in people's training. But I think it was really interesting to me how not careful, but how respectful the coaches were of an athlete's fatigue limits.
Yeah, absolutely. Could you you spoke about just before that they train the visual system and vestibular. Could you just give us some examples of visual type of exercises that athletes would use, and then also vestibular training as well?
Oh, some of the more mainstream ways that I think people are familiar with and have probably seen on social media. They've probably seen these fit lights, so these sort of lights that light up and athletes have to quickly dash over and swipe the light out, and that's kind of there's a visual input to that, obviously, for you to be able to see the light, and you're reacting with a sort of motor response to the light, so that can improve some aspects of hand-eye, foot-eye coordination. There's strobe goggles. Recently, I think Nike actually brought out a pair of strobe goggles, and the idea of these is to reduce the amount of visual information, so kind of increase your predictive capability. So someone's throwing a fast ball at you, the lenses would black out on a sort of a set sort of frequency, so they would cycle in and out and give you less visual information, so you had to work with less, so you'd become better at catching and predicting where the ball would go without visual input. So that was, again, quite popular. And I think that has, again, permeated down into the sort of pro sports world. But for me, often more basic technology. So, can they converge? Can they bring both eyes in together? When you're judging the distance of something, if you can't have both your eyes work together as a team, that puts you at quite a serious handicap, really. I mean, your brain can compensate. So it's not to say that I haven't tested competent athletes and found that they've not been able to converge, and they're still able to catch, they're still able to drive.
Well, I guess it comes to that predictive part.
So their brain fills in the blanks, and they get really good at filling in those blanks. But it's, again, and it's not to say that they wouldn't improve if we couldn't improve that. So oftentimes we'll still work with those people on improving their convergence, improving their ability to switch from near to far with their eyes. Their ability to saccade, so move from player A to player B to their right side and then to their left side again. So being able to switch your focus point quickly and accurately is super important in sports. So there's a bunch of sort of visual qualities that would be trained, including peripheral vision. So getting in a team sport environment is particularly important to know where your kind of players are, that you can pass to, for instance. So I think all of these can be trained, and the vestibular system is essentially your inbuilt spirit level. It kind of helps you balance, and so that's also trainable.
Okay, and so just a quick example of, obviously you spoke about the drills for visual, but in terms of vestibular, what would be something that how you could train an athlete or a person with a vestibular system?
Well, there's a bunch of different tools. If you visit some of the guys in the US at some of the really nice facilities where they've got a nice big budget to train these things, they'll sometimes put you in things that look like the astronaut training chairs where they spin you around, and they really challenge your vestibular system with that. But for me, if you're working with, I don't know, Mrs. Smith in the gym, you can work with them turning their head quickly, keeping a visual fixation on the target. So that's a kind of a vestibular ocular reflex drill. You can get them to do some of these exercises with their eyes closed. You can challenge their balance while they do these exercises, so get them in sort of what we call a Romberg's position, so their feet together. And then we're looking at how much their body sways and how much they lose balance. So you can kind of measure these things as well, which is nice.
Are there any pet peeves that you see in, whether it's a commercial gym or things that you see and you think, why? And you might have perhaps been making these mistakes years ago as a coach and as a trainer, and you think, they could be doing something different? Or is there anything that comes to mind when?
I think not really. I think, we've all got to go through that learning process. So I think, a lot of the coaches that you see in the commercial gyms are just trying to make a living, often trying to help people the best way they can, and are probably frustrated themselves at not getting great results. So I think, most of us have been somewhere along that continuum ourselves at some point in our career. But I guess more generally speaking, I think I get a little disillusioned with our industry, particularly the guys that are on performance enhancing drugs with a million pictures of themselves on social media, telling their client that 2 workouts a week and some dedication on their nutrition, they can look like them. And it's like, that's not really true. That guy, I see him in the gym 7 days a week taking his performance enhancing drugs and a ton of supplements, as I say, 7 days a week, tons of time in the gym. Mr. and Mrs. Smith don't have that time. If they've got successful careers, which they usually have to pay for personal training, they need to do their job. They can't be in the gym all the time.
Yeah.
Sometimes they've got families. They want to spend time with them. Sometimes they've got other interests. And I don't think it then boils down to a lack of dedication or motivation on Mr. and Mrs. Smith's part for not achieving those results that this trainer's achieved. I think it just boils down to them misselling the dream. And I think that's the thing that bothers me most about our industry,
Yeah, and it's very prevalent on social media, and particularly in this region, as you know, is heavily based on aesthetics, optics, how you look, how good your Instagram feed is versus perhaps maybe the results that you've got with your clients.
Yeah. And there are some great gyms, I think, out there that are quite well known that do produce some great results with clients in very short time frames. But I'd sometimes also question even those results and say, is that maintainable for most people?
Yeah.
And I think, again, it's maybe 20% of people that are able to achieve those results or willing to push themselves to that degree. And then of that 20%, I'd be really interested to know how many continue that and in a year still look like that or somewhere similar.
Yeah.
Because I don't think it'd be very high.
Yeah.
And I think perhaps a slightly slower, kinder approach that is more consistent with their lifestyle is probably better for most people.
Yeah, well, that's in line with Dan John, who I had on the podcast. His famous quote is "little and often over the long haul."
Yeah,
and it's like, and that's coming from a guy who's done it for 5 decades of training. And the secret is to do it for 5 decades is not necessarily to do your 12-week program. At the end of your 12-week program, what are you going to do? Probably go down to Cheesecake Factory, and
that's how most people celebrate, right?
Exactly. So, being obviously a top-level coach and someone who's sort of reading and studying all the time, I'm sort of interested in your daily habits and routines in terms of what you do and what you believe in for yourself with your own training. Just give us a rundown of what your day looks like, and if you establish any habits in terms of whether it's meditation, breathing habits, and then also like your reading, how often you read and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, so my day normally starts pretty early, as is most PT's life. So I'm up at sort of 5:30, maybe 6 o'clock, and then usually in the gym at 7. So it's a pretty early start. I generally find fasting intermittently for me is also really for keeping me in reasonable shape. So obviously from a sort of calorie standpoint, it reduces my overall calorie intake, and it really fits with a busy early morning. I don't miss food, I don't feel hungry, and I'll have a couple of coffees and I'm great. So by the time sort of the morning rush is over, so that'll be several hours of PT, I normally then duck out for some lunch, and that's when the sort of studying starts. And I'm pretty religious about that because there's so much material out there, and there's so much stuff that's constantly changing, and I enjoy it. Again, it wouldn't be realistic for everyone to follow this sort of routine, but I always try to get some study in around lunch. It's usually a couple of hours every day. And I think even people like Charles Poliquin recommended that people consume so many books a year to keep up their learning and to keep their ideas fresh and to sort of challenge their current belief system. So I still subscribe to that heavily.
And do you split yourself between like reading studies, then obviously courses, but then books as well, not necessarily textbooks?
Yeah, so I think I've read, I've waxed and waned between different things at different times, and I think that for me has helped to keep me focused and motivated to continue learning in these different theatres. So more recently I was reading some sort of more kind of coaching, sort of mindset type books and material to help me get clients to do some of the stuff I knew perhaps would be good for them. And then, you know, I'll always keep an element of sort of neurological stuff going in there. So some medical neuroscience recently, some books on sort of therapies that are based around sort of latest principles in neuroscience. And then obviously for my own sanity, a little bit of fiction every now and again as well, just to completely detach from it all. So I try to keep the books balanced on that front as well. Yeah.
And you do, I think you said 2 hours on average, roughly?
Yeah, I would say 2 hours every day is what I consistently get in. And actually, interesting you mentioned studies. I found studies, it's really interesting. I'll sometimes send a little group a study or two, but what you'll know about studies now is that there's as many to argue the opposite position as there are for a particular position or idea. So I think I've definitely become better over the years at being able to discriminate good studies and bad studies. You know, a study with one participant, you know, funded by the company that's selling the product.
On some rats.
It's probably not a good one to quote. You know, ones that have been, you know, double-blinded, they're placebo-controlled, they appear to not be having perhaps any impact from companies that supply chemicals, supplements, gadgets, whatever it is that's being studied. So if it's not funded and it's well controlled, and more importantly, people can replicate it in other labs, then obviously you've got a little bit more to kind of hold on to there. So I don't read so many studies now. I try and discriminate a little bit more on those because you could be there all day. Yeah,
and then in terms of any breathing or drills you actually do yourself?
Yeah, so I've got quite a mixed routine, really. I don't try to do any one thing too consistently, which may sound like a really bad idea, but you know, I'll consistently assess myself. So I'll assess my vision, my vestibular system. I have a couple of friends that occasionally where I need an objective pair of eyes, you know, especially when I'm off studying, I get to hang out with these guys. They'll test me and send me away with some things to work on. But I try and keep my training very varied. I do lots of different things with my own physical training. So I do some calisthenics, some gymnastics, some Olympic lifting, some aerobic work.
And you obviously still do a few bicep curls?
Not so many as you'd think. Some pull-ups for sure. But I still try and get a little bit of heavy lifting in. I still inevitably drawn to a little bit of occasionally what feels like a bodybuilding workout. It does feel nice to get one of those in every now and again. But I'm not on a sort of consistent program when it comes to sort of conditioning or strength development, because I don't really have a goal other than to be good at as many things as I can be. I guess you call it general preparation. It's sort of, you know, if I wanted to go for a run, I could do. If I wanted to go bust out some pull-ups, I can do. If I want to do a handstand, I can do. So, you know, these things, I think, for me now, feel that feels like a good balance. Yeah, that's a good answer. Now, we're getting to the end of the interview. I've got a few rapid-fire questions for you. Okay.
And, you can take as long as you want to answer them. So if you could pick one book, what's your all-time favourite, whether it's training, whether it's nutrition, whether it's neuro, whether it's... You need to pick one book. What would it be?
Man... I don't think I have a good answer for that.
Or you can pick, maybe pick three. You can pick from your top three topics, or maybe a book that started the journey for you, or something that peeled back the layers of the onion for you.
I think one. I don't even necessarily think it's a good book now, but it was definitely one that stimulated the thought process that I'm currently following.
Yeah.
It was the brain that changed itself. I think it's Norman Deutsch. So he talks about plasticity, basically, and he talks about how the brain can rewire itself. So for me, it was a really interesting idea. And yeah, it was my first exposure to neuroplasticity. So
okay, it's a good answer. A favorite movie?
Oh God, I'm a bit of a geek. I think it's
Star Wars.
No, not quite that bad. I think actually it's probably The Matrix. I think that's the first film I left the cinema going, wow, that could be happening now. Maybe it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think as a kid that had the most impact on me. That and probably Jurassic Park.
Yeah.
Yeah. When I was really young.
Like dinosaurs.
Oh man, I was into dinosaurs.
What do you have any sort of quotes that you'd say on a daily basis? Doesn't have to be I know you're not into the sort of airy-fairy sort of stuff, but in terms of what might encapsulate who you are or what you're doing, is there any sort of things that you'd say on a daily basis or famous quotes that you'd use from someone else?
I'm not into quotes. I think if I have a bit of a mantra, particularly for sort of clients, it's, trying to focus on the 20% of stuff that gives them 80% of their results, that Pareto principle that Tim Ferriss talks a lot about. I think I'm a big fan of that idea. And I think, as we said before, the fitness industry oftentimes gets people to focus on that 80% that's giving very diminishing returns. So definitely feel like that underpins my approach and general attitude to most things. Yeah.
Now we spoke about Cheesecake Factory before, but not everyone would know your love for cheesecake.
My nickname, yeah,
so the
cheesecake. Next
question was a favourite cheat meal. So you can give us a rundown of what that is.
I think it's got to be the Cajun Chicken Littles at Cheesecake Factory, which is clearly enough for two people to eat, followed by cheesecake. And
Which
I don't
one?
think I discriminate, actually. I've got an open door policy on most cheesecake. So
it's funny. We'll see on social media. Ollie's been to Cheesecake Factory. He's taken a photo. Doesn't usually contribute a lot on social media, but when he does, it's usually around cheesecakes.
Yep.
Now, probably the last question is basically if you could go back and give yourself advice when you first started your training.
Yeah.
What would there be anything you impart and point Ollie in the direction of back then?
Yeah, a couple of things. I think the two biggest things would be don't trust too willingly or too quickly the industry experts and gurus out there, because some of them have their own agendas, products to sell, courses, everything else. And as I said, a lot of it's not been filtered through a scientific thing of, does this actually make sense? It's just empirically worked with a handful of people. So I think, being able to make your own mind up and do your own research and test it on real life human beings, I think would be one of my bits of advice. And the other would be to perhaps not focus so much on the specifics and, more broadly speaking, become a better coach. So perhaps invest more time early on in the how do you get people to do some of this stuff, and how do you get them to become really invested and really motivated to make their own change? Because, as I said before, learning all about the endocrine system and all of the Krebs cycle and everything else that goes into cellular metabolism is great, but at the end of the day, if you can't change the way your client's behaving and get them some great results, then that doesn't matter. Yeah.
That's some great advice. I think everyone should take a little bit of that. Now, for people, if they want to get in touch with you, what's the best place? And where obviously we work together, but
through the D5 website, you can find our contact details on there. And if you give a great reception team a call there, they'll book you in for a session with me. We offer a bunch of different services, really, that kind of encapsulate some of the stuff I do, from regular personal training to posturology, which is again, specifically sort of geared up to help people correct their posture.
Yeah.
And also a new product that we're now about to sort of launch, neurocalibration, which is essentially just identifying these weak areas that you might want to improve to increase your overall performance, whether it be kind of cognitive or sports related. So D5, check out the website.
Yeah, and then also if someone was from another country, could they, if they had some pain or something like that and they wanted to consult with you, do you do online consults? I'm not sure.
They're a little bit more challenging because there's no one there hands-on to test some of the stuff. So often I'll coordinate with, and I still get lots of referrals from other health professionals that are perhaps stuck with kind of challenging issues and injuries, where they'll be my eyes and ears. I'll ask them to perform a certain test, and then we'll figure out what the result of that is. So it's usually best done with an extra set of hands.
Yeah.
So
awesome. Well, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, no worries. Any questions anyone has, then I'm happy to answer through social media and get back to them.
Awesome. Thanks again.
Yeah, no worries.